Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Let's get right into it.
So you reach into your pocket, right? You pull out a rectangular piece of plastic and you just tap it against a glass screen at a coffee shop.
Mm-hmm.
A machine emits a short beep. You walk away with a hot beverage, and the person behind the counter goes back to work.
It's a completely seamless interaction.
Exactly. There is this expectation of precision. The numbers on a digital screen somewhere adjust, the transaction is clean, and both parties are satisfied.
And we do this every single day.
We do, largely without thinking about the profound layers of abstraction that make that single beep possible. So we are taking a deep dive into the history of money today.
A core part of the economic history series.
Right. And the mission here is to trace how human societies actually develop these systems to quantify value, to settle debts, and enable exchange.
From the very beginning.
Yeah, from a Babylonian priest pressing a reed into wet clay, all the way to the decentralized digital ledgers you interact with today.
And as we look at the sources, it becomes really clear that this is not merely a chronicle of coins and paper.
No, it's about exploring the evolution of human trust.
Trust and the mechanics of social obligation, and heavily the exertion of state power.
Because the physical objects we associate with wealth.
The cowrie shells, the silver discs, the cotton blend bills.
Right. Those are ultimately just vessels.
Yeah, to understand the function of money, the historical record requires us to look past those physical objects. We have to examine the underlying social structures that actually give them their meaning.
So let us start at the foundational level, which it actually requires dismantling a story most of us learned in introductory economics.
That's the classic barter myth.
Exactly. For centuries, the standard narrative, stretching from the Greek philosopher Aristotle right through to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, it relies on this concept known as the double coincidence of wants.
Which is a very specific, neat story.
It is. The story we are told is that money was invented spontaneously out of pure listicle frustration.
Right. Classical theory paints this picture of early human interaction, where a farmer has a surplus of grain and he wants a pair of shoes.
So he has to search for a cobbler.
But not just any cobbler. He has to find a cobbler who has a finished pair of shoes ready to trade and who also happens to want a sack of grain at that exact moment.
Which is a huge logistical headache.
That friction, that double coincidence, is presented as the catalyst for the invention of money.
So the community just spontaneously agrees upon a third widely desired commodity.
Like salt or cattle or a precious metal.
Right, and they use it as a medium of exchange. It's a highly logical explanation. It makes perfect sense to a modern market-oriented mind.
But the sources point to a significant flaw in this narrative.
Yeah, when we actually consult the anthropological and historical records, it falls apart.
Completely. Anthropologists like David Graeber and Caroline Humphrey have studied this extensively.
And what do they find?
Well, when you examine the ethnographic evidence of societies operating without formalized currency, you find a complete absence of this hypothetical barter economy.
A complete absence.
Yeah, there is no historical record of a pure barter system ever existing as the primary day-to-day mode of exchange within a single community.
But barter did happen, right?
It certainly occurred, but typically between strangers or rival groups where trust was low and, violence was a potential outcome.
Okay, so within a cohesive community, it operated differently.
Entirely different principles.
The sources outline how early hunter-gatherer societies actually functioned. Take the Juhoansi of southern Africa, for example.
Right.
Instead of trading a specific amount of gathered berries for a specific cut of meat, they operated on systems of generalized reciprocity.
Which means resources are distributed communally. There is no strict accounting or demand for immediate equivalent repayment.
So if a hunting party was successful, they just shared the meat broadly.
Yeah, and this was not an act of pure altruism. It was a calculated evolutionary survival strategy.
Building social capital.
Exactly. By sharing the meat, the hunters were ensuring that weeks later, when they inevitably returned empty-handed, another successful hunter would share with them.
So the system prioritized social cohesion and collective risk-sharing over individualized accounting.
Yes, and we see this extend to early agrarian communities as well, through systems of balanced reciprocity.
Which involves delayed returns. The sources detail the Kula ring of the Trobriand Islanders in the Pacific.
A really notable example.
These islanders would embark on these perilous canoe journeys just to ceremonially exchange shell necklaces and armbands across vast distances.
Items that held immense symbolic and prestige value.
Right, and the exchanges built complex political alliances. But crucially, there were no fixed prices. You did not trade 3 armbands for a canoe.
No, the Kula ring demonstrates how exchange was deeply embedded in social relations.
Which leads to David Graeber's theory.
Yeah, Graeber theorized that the very concept of money emerged first as a unit of account to quantify debt, long before it became a physical medium of exchange.
So the unquantifiable, I owe you a favor, became quantifiable.
Exactly. It transitioned into a notion of, I owe you one specific unit of something. The historical timeline suggests credit and debt preceded physical money by thousands of years.
I am trying to visualize this transition from the theoretical to the practical. Let us think about a small prehistoric community functioning somewhat like a modern neighborhood potluck.
Okay, a plot?
Yeah. If you attend a potluck, you do not walk up to your neighbor and demand a slice of their pizza in direct calculated exchange for a scoop of your potato salad.
No, you just put your dish on the table.
Right. You give freely, participating in a shared social contract. You know the collective offerings will ensure you get a full plate in return. You leave with a sense of communal balance, not a ledger of debts.
That's a very apt way to look at it.
But how does that informal potluck-style trust transition into hard, cold numbers? What forces us to move from communal sharing to a strict institutionalized ledger?
That fundamental shift is intrinsically tied to scale. Yes, it's a byproduct of the transition towards sedentary agriculture and the resulting population density.
Right, because in a mobile band of 30 to 50 people, informal trust works.
Social memory is perfectly sufficient. Everyone knows everyone else's contributions. But when populations concentrate into the first large urban centers,
Like in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE.
exactly, those informal face-to-face networks can no longer sustain the economy. You are dealing with thousands of inhabitants, specialized labor, massive agricultural logistics.
You can no longer rely on social memory alone.
No, you need a formal system of accounting. The establishment of these first cities provided the infrastructure for a new form of money, which was asset-backed credit managed by centralized institutions.
Let us look closely at that Bronze Age transition. In Sumer, the large temple complexes essentially acted as the earliest iterations of central banks.
They managed the massive agricultural surpluses.
Right, the surplus from the surrounding lands. And this environment birthed the shekel.
But the shekel was not initially a coin.
No, not rattling in a merchant's pouch. It was a unit of weight and a unit of account, nominally equivalent to roughly 8.33 grams of silver.
And that specific weight of silver was legally established as equivalent to 300 silla of barley.
Which is about 180 liters.
Fixing that exchange rate between a precious metal and the primary staple crop provided the society with a highly stable unit of account.
So a farmer would harvest their barley, transport it to the city,
and deposit it in the massive temple storehouses. The temple scribes would record this deposit on cuneiform clay tablets,
so they get a receipt.
often utilizing clay tokens, which could then be used to pay administrative fees, settle debts to the temple, or acquire other goods.
And the crucial detail here is that the physical silver was rarely handled by commoners.
Rarely, if ever. The silver remained stationary, locked safely in the temple vaults. It just acted as a standard of value.
While the clay ledgers did all the actual work tracking the transactions.
Yes, but managing that system required a staggering amount of administration.
Because the scribes were tracking deposits, but also loans.
Loans for agricultural tools, seed grain, trade expeditions. And the sources note that interest charges were a standard feature of this economy.
The interest rate for a grain loan was often 1/3 of the principal.
Which is exceptionally high.
Right, and in a volatile agricultural society, a poor harvest meant a farmer could not repay.
And compounded interest at that rate quickly led to unmanageable debt.
Which frequently resulted in the farmer having to sell their land or their family members or themselves into debt slavery.
The systemic risk of that compounding debt was enormous. If too much of the population fell into debt peonage, the city-state would lose its agricultural workforce.
And its military levies.
Exactly. This is why institutional solvency required dramatic, periodic intervention.
Debt amnesties.
Rulers would frequently decree massive debt amnesties. They would essentially declare a clean slate, wiping out certain classes of agricultural debts and freeing debt slaves.
Just to prevent total systemic collapse.
The governing authority recognized that preserving the overall stability of the palatial economy took precedence over enforcing individual debt contracts.
We see parallel developments of commodity money emerging globally, tailored to local environments.
Like in ancient China.
Yeah, during the Shang and Zhou dynasties, cowrie shells were widely utilized as a medium of exchange. And as metalworking advanced, those shells evolved into bronze replicas.
Eventually taking the shape of familiar tools like spades and knives.
And in India, around the 6th century BCE, we see the emergence of small silver punch-marked coins known as karshapanas.
The Karshapanas represent a distinct shift in the technology of exchange.
Because before that, a merchant had to independently weigh a piece of silver and test its purity for every single transaction.
Right, which is tedious. So a central authority started stamping the metal with specific symbols.
Geometric patterns, animals, celestial bodies.
That stamp served as a certification of weight and purity.
But the leap to what we consider modern coinage, that occurred in Lydia.
Located in modern-day Turkey, somewhere between 650 and 600 BCE.
The Lydians began minting the first stamped coins out of electrum, which is a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver.
Found in local riverbeds.
So I want to try and square this development with what we just discussed about Mesopotamia. You detailed this highly functional system in Sumer. The temple manages the ledger. The debts are meticulously tracked on clay,
It was incredibly efficient.
operating much like a modern centralized cloud spreadsheet. So if that ledger system worked so well, why take the massive, labor-intensive step of digging metal out of the ground, smelting it, and stamping a royal lion on it?
Why need physical coins?
Exactly. What specific problem does a physical coin actually solve that the clay tablet did not?
The limitation of the clay tablet becomes glaringly obvious the moment you attempt to transact outside the city gates.
Because of trust.
Yes. The temple's ledger requires everyone involved to submit to the same centralized authority. That works within the borders of Uruk or Babylon.
But not for long-distance trade.
Right. As maritime and overland trade networks flourished, merchants dealt with strangers who had zero allegiance to a Mesopotamian temple.
And geopolitics played a role, too.
Huge role. Rulers increasingly relied on mercenary soldiers to fight their wars. A mercenary traveling hundreds of miles from home cannot be paid in a clay receipt for barley stored in a distant vault.
They need a durable, portable asset.
They need a proxy commodity that carries its value intrinsically, independent of any local ledger.
So the physical coin bridges the gap of trust between strangers.
Precisely. By taking a lump of electrum and stamping it with a royal seal, the state standardizes the value.
It provides a guarantee.
And it eliminated the immense friction of trade. A merchant no longer needed to carry scales and assaying tools for every purchase. They could simply count the coins.
The introduction of standardized coinage spurred an entirely new set of economic behaviors as we move into classical antiquity.
Because wealth is now concentrated in easily transportable coins.
Right, circulating across the Mediterranean. And that creates a need for financial intermediaries.
Which brings us to the Hellenistic world, post-Alexander the Great.
As Greek influence expanded, we see the formalization of banking as a distinct profession, the emergence of the trapezitai.
The first private bankers. The term originates from the trapezi, which were the literal wooden tables they set up in the agoras.
The public marketplaces.
Yeah, and they provided services that mirror modern retail banking. Secure deposits, currency exchange for the myriad of different city-state mints, and interest-bearing loans.
Crucially, they also facilitated early forms of payment transfers via written acknowledgments.
Which was vital.
If a merchant in Athens needed to pay a supplier in another city, they could arrange a transfer through a network of trusted trapezitai, settling the debt without physically moving heavy chests of silver on a ship.
Where they could be lost to storms or pirates.
Temples continued to play a role too. The sources highlight the sanctuary of Apollo at Delos,
Acting as a massive proto-bank.
extending short-term credit to entire city-states, and we see large-scale state banks maturing as well.
In Ptolemaic Egypt, for instance.
They merged Greek financial instruments with the highly centralized pharaonic granary systems.
Issuing credits secured by grain deposits. They deeply integrated the agricultural output of the Nile with the monetized, coin-based economy of the broader Mediterranean.
Let us move westward to the Roman Empire. The sources offer a narrative vignette regarding the Temple of Juno Moneta in Rome.
Which served as the central mint for the Republic.
And it is the direct linguistic ancestor of the English words mint and money. But Rome's long-term monetary history is ultimately defined by a specific practice.
Debasement.
The basement. The backbone of the Roman economy was a silver coin called the denarius.
Around 211 BCE, a standard denarius contained approximately 4.5 grams of nearly pure silver.
A highly trusted currency.
But as the empire expanded, successive emperors faced mounting fiscal pressures. So they systematically reduced the actual silver content of the coin.
They would melt down older coins, mix the silver with cheaper base metals like copper or bronze, and mint a larger quantity of new coins.
The physical denarius looked largely the same, but its intrinsic value was collapsing.
By 270, the denarius contained a mere zero point 0.5 grams of silver.
It was essentially a bronze coin with a thin silver wash.
The result, inevitably, was severe inflation. Merchants realized the coins were worth less, so they demanded more of them.
Standard economic reaction.
But I want to examine the strict moral framing we often apply to this process. Historical accounts frequently describe these emperors as simply greedy or maliciously destroying the currency.
Right, that's the common narrative.
But we need to view this through the lens of statecraft. Is debasing the coinage simply the ancient world's equivalent of modern deficit spending during a severe national crisis?
That's a highly practical way to view it. You have to consider the fiscal tools actually available to an ancient administrative state.
They didn't have global bond markets.
Exactly. They could not issue sovereign debt to borrow against the future wealth of the empire. When an emperor faced a massive crisis, like a border war or a plague,
Or needing to pay a restless military legion to prevent a coup.
they had very few options. Raising taxes on an agrarian population was slow and risked open rebellion.
So, stretching the silver supply was the fastest lever they could pull.
It was an immediate administrative mechanism to artificially increase the state's purchasing power. It allowed them to pay the soldiers today with the diluted silver.
It functioned as a hidden tax on everyone holding the currency.
While it was a functional short-term fiscal tool to survive a crisis, the cumulative effect over generations eroded public trust and destroyed purchasing power.
Contributing to the severe economic instability of the later empire.
Yes, and the economic fragmentation following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire led to a localized patchwork monetary system across much of Europe.
Local lords minting their own varied currencies. But while Europe entered the Middle Ages, massive financial innovations were occurring in the Islamic world and in China.
Let us examine the Islamic Golden Age first, spanning the 8th to the 13th centuries.
The Islamic world established a vigorous monetary economy stretching from Spain to India, anchored by a stable bimetallic standard.
Utilizing the gold dinar, weighing approximately 4.25 grams, alongside the silver dirham.
The Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik standardized this coinage system around 696.
A notable feature of these coins was the removal of all figurative imagery.
Right, no portraits of rulers or gods, in strict adherence to Islamic anachonism.
Instead, the coins were inscribed with Quranic verses and the year and location of minting.
Creating a highly standardized, universally recognizable currency. But the truly transformative innovations went far beyond the physical coins.
Islamic financial practices were heavily influenced by the strict religious prohibition of riba.
Which is the charging of usury or interest on loans.
Because merchants could not simply lend money for a fixed return, they had to develop alternative financing models,
Like mudarababa.
which essentially function as a profit-sharing partnership, bearing similarities to modern venture capital.
So a capital provider entrusts funds to a merchant, and they agree in advance on how to split the potential profits.
Crucially, if the venture failed, the capital provider absorbed the financial loss. The merchant lost their time and effort.
Distributing the risk without relying on fixed interest debt.
And they also developed highly sophisticated instruments for the long-distance transfer of wealth.
The sources detail the use of the sack, the precursor to the modern check, and the suftaja, which operated as a bill of exchange.
Vital for managing logistics across a vast empire. A merchant traveling from Baghdad to Basra did not want to carry a chest of gold dinars across a desert controlled by bandits.
It is remarkably similar in function to the modern SWIFT banking network or a digital wire transfer.
Yes, a merchant could deposit physical gold in Baghdad, receive a suftaja, and a partner banking house in Basra would pay out the equivalent value upon presentation of the document.
Seamless movement of immense value purely through information and trust. Meanwhile, further east in China, the abstraction of value was taking an even more radical leap.
The invention of the first paper money.
During the Tang and Song dynasties, the traditional Chinese currency consisted of small copper coins with square holes strung together on cords.
But as the economy rapidly expanded, The sheer physical weight of the copper required for large transactions became an overwhelming logistical burden.
So merchants began utilizing paper promissory notes representing deposits of heavy coins left with trusted shops.
The state eventually recognized the efficiency of this system and took control. By the Song dynasty, the government was issuing official, state-backed paper money.
A staggering technological leap.
But the story takes a darker turn under the subsequent Mongol-led Yuan dynasty.
The Yuan administration began issuing paper currency without maintaining sufficient metal reserves,
Printing massive quantities of unbacked paper to fund continuous military campaigns, which inevitably triggered devastating hyperinflation.
rendering the paper worthless. But despite that collapse, the initial implementation was centuries ahead of the rest of the world.
It presents an interesting contrast with Europe during this exact same medieval period.
Because Europe was relying on far more rudimentary systems. The sources point out that a primary method of recording debt in Europe was the tally stick.
A concept dating all the way back to the Argnation era, some 30,000 years ago.
In medieval England, the exchequer used split wooden sticks with notches carved into them to record taxes and debts owed to the crown.
One half kept by the state, the other by the debtor. They could be matched to verify the debt.
Europe only began a serious return to high-quality gold coinage in the 13th century, with cities like Florence minting the gold florin.
Right.
So a question arises. Paper money seems like an incredibly obvious, highly efficient technological upgrade. Why did it take centuries for paper money to catch on in Europe, despite China proving its viability so early?
The delay in Europe was not a failure of imagination. It was a lack of the necessary political infrastructure.
Meaning state power.
Implementing a paper money system requires an immense foundational layer of institutional trust and centralized authority.
Like the imperial state in China.
Exactly. They had a vast bureaucracy capable of enforcing the use of paper, and crucially, they demanded that taxes be paid in that specific paper.
Which instantly gives it universal value.
Medieval Europe, by contrast, was highly fractured. A patchwork of competing feudal lords and independent city-states.
No single authority powerful enough to simply declare a piece of paper valuable.
So paper money and advanced credit systems had to find a back door into the European economy. They arrived not by royal decree, but through the private sector.
Specifically, the goldsmiths.
Yes, this takes us into early modern Europe, focusing on 17th century London.
The political climate of the English Civil War era was highly volatile. Traditionally, wealthy merchants entrusted their bullion to the vaults of the royal mint.
Assuming the crown provided the ultimate security.
But in 1640, King Charles I made a disastrous fiscal decision. Facing a severe shortage of funds, he forcibly seized the private gold stored in the mint.
Treating it as a forced loan, that single action completely shattered the trust between the mercantile class and the state repository.
The merchants suddenly realized their wealth was not safe in the king's hands.
They desperately needed a secure alternative, so they turned to the private goldsmiths operating in London.
Craftsmen who already possessed highly secure strong boxes and vaults, and the expertise to assay precious metals.
So a merchant would deposit a bag of gold coins with a goldsmith for safekeeping.
In return, the goldsmith issued a simple, handwritten paper receipt certifying the exact quantity and purity of the metal held in trust.
At first, this was just a coat check system for money.
But gradually, the behavior changed. If I owed you a large sum for a shipment of wool, instead of me going to the goldsmith, withdrawing the heavy bags of gold, and physically handing them to you,
You could simply endorse the goldsmith's receipt and hand the piece of paper to me.
you now held the claim to the gold. These receipts evolved into transferable bearer notes.
Whoever held the paper owned the gold. This is a critical juncture.
Because prominent goldsmiths, like Edward Backwell, began to notice a statistical pattern.
Since the paper receipts were so convenient, the merchants rarely came back to the vaults to physically withdraw their gold.
Only a small fraction of depositors would demand their physical metal on any given day.
The vast majority of the gold just sat idle in the vaults.
This realization is the spark that birthed fractional reserve banking.
The goldsmiths realized they could actively put that idle gold to work. They began lending out a significant portion of the deposited gold to other merchants.
Charging interest on the loans while keeping only a fraction, maybe 20 to 50%, in reserve to handle withdrawals.
Or they would simply write out new paper promissory notes as loans, backed by the gold sitting in the vault.
The profound implication here is that the goldsmiths were effectively creating money out of thin air. They were multiplying the money supply.
The original depositor held a paper receipt, giving them a claim to the gold. And the new borrower held a paper note granting them purchasing power backed by the exact same physical metal.
Two people now believed they had access to the value of one pile of gold.
And the entire system relies on an illusion of continuous liquidity.
It relies on the confidence that not everyone will show up at once, but confidence is fragile. If a rumor spreads that the goldsmith has made bad loans, panic ensues.
Everyone rushes to the vault simultaneously. The goldsmith only has a fraction of the total deposits, and they fail.
We saw this systemic fragility exposed dramatically in 1672. King Charles II defaulted on the crown's massive debts.
In an event known as the Stop of the Exchequer.
This royal default triggered widespread panic and a massive run on the goldsmiths. Many prominent figures, including Edward Backwell, were financially ruined.
Because they had lent heavily to the crown. It was a catastrophic contraction, but the economic utility of paper credit was simply too powerful to abandon.
Instead, the ensuing decades saw the rapid institutionalization and regulation of these financial practices.
The foundations were laid earlier, of course. The Antwerp Stock Exchange had been established in 1531 to trade debt instruments.
The Amsterdam Stock Exchange followed in 1602, facilitating trading of shares in the Dutch East India Company.
In Sweden, Stockholm's Banco formalized the issuance of the first true European banknotes in 1657.
And critically, in 1694, the Bank of England was founded, providing a structured national framework for note issuance.
I want to linger on the concept of fractional reserve banking because it remains the foundation of our modern system.
Right. It feels very similar to a parking garage attendant who takes the keys to your car when you head into the office.
The attendant knows your schedule. They know you reliably stay at your desk until 5 o'clock.
So during the middle of the day, the attendant decides to rent your car out to other people running errands, betting heavily that those people will return the car before you finish work.
And as long as the timing works out, the attendant makes a profit, the errands get run, and you are none the wiser when you pick up your car at 5 o'clock.
But if you get sick and come back at noon, or a fire alarm goes off and everyone demands their cars at the exact same moment, the illusion shatters.
Yes. So I have to press you on the fundamental nature of this mechanism. Is fractional reserve banking inherently a sophisticated confidence trick, or is it a vital, necessary engine for human economic growth?
The compelling truth is that it operates as both simultaneously. Yes, it is built on a statistical probability, a shared confidence.
That total liquidity won't be demanded by everyone at once.
Exactly. When that confidence holds, it is arguably the most powerful engine for economic expansion ever devised.
Because a strict one-to-one commodity system traps capital.
It leaves gold sitting uselessly in a vault. Fractional reserve banking mobilizes that idle capital. It allows merchants to access the vast amounts of credit required to fund long-distance trade, build factories, and construct infrastructure.
Leaps in societal wealth that would be mathematically impossible otherwise.
But you are correct to highlight the systemic vulnerability. When the foundational trust evaporates, the contraction is incredibly violent, resulting in bank runs and deep economic depressions. The chaotic currencies of the early modern period generated a massive global desire for strict stability. Nations wanted an anchor.
Which brings us to the era of the classical gold standard.
And there is a real irony here in that Britain's formal path to the gold standard was somewhat accidental.
Through Sir Isaac Newton.
Right. In 1717, Newton, acting as the master of the Russell Mint, was tasked with setting the official exchange ratio between gold and silver coins.
He set the ratio at exactly 1 to 15.21.
Which, in this specific instance, slightly overvalued gold relative to the fluctuating rates on the broader markets.
Triggering an economic phenomenon known as Gresham's Law.
Which dictates that legally overvalued currency will drive undervalued currency out of circulation.
Because silver was worth more abroad than it was within the British Mint's official ratio, merchants hoarded the silver coins.
Melted them down or shipped them overseas to buy cheaper gold. The silver simply vanished from domestic circulation, and the gold guinea became the dominant coin.
Britain formally embraced this reality with the Resumption Act of 1819, legally mandating the Bank of England to resume specie payments by 1823.
Though they started a bit early in 1821, and because Britain was the undisputed powerhouse of the global economy, this policy exerted immense pull on the rest of the world.
Germany officially adopted the gold standard in 1871, utilizing the massive gold reparations they extracted from France to replace their traditional silver thalers.
The Latin Monetary Union followed suit. By 1900, the United States had officially formalized its commitment, placing the majority of the industrialized world on a single standard.
Operating under this rigid system forced central banks to solidify their practices. The Bank of England established the rules of the game.
Their primary tool was the discount rate, the interest rate they charged to commercial banks.
If Britain was importing more than it exported, physical gold would flow out to settle the deficit. To halt this drain, the Bank of England would raise the discount rate.
A higher interest rate attracted foreign capital back into London and cooled down domestic borrowing.
Furthermore, the bank cemented its role as the lender of last resort, providing emergency liquidity during panics to institutions with solid collateral.
The transition to a strict gold standard was not universally praised, though. We see this immense friction play out in the United States in a fierce political conflict known as the Silver Wars.
And it is essential we look at this impartially, as it deeply divided the economic interests of the nation.
The core of the debate centered on whether the U.S. dollar should be backed exclusively by gold or by a combination of gold and silver.
The legislative turning point was the Coinage Act of 1873. This act effectively ended the right of citizens to have silver bullion struck into fully legal tender dollar coins.
Quietly placing the United States on a de facto gold standard, opponents vehemently branded this legislation the crime of 1873.
The division was deeply geographical and class-based. The agrarian farmers in the South and West were heavily burdened by mortgages and loans.
Adhering strictly to gold restricted the money supply, which caused deflation.
And deflation meant the prices the farmers could get for their crops were dropping. But the fixed dollar amount of their bank debts remained exactly the same.
They were being squeezed, so their political solution was to demand free silver.
They wanted the government to resume the unlimited coinage of silver at a fixed ratio of 16-to-1 with gold.
Their explicit goal was to vastly expand the money supply, purposefully trigger inflation, and thereby make their debts cheaper to pay off.
On the opposing side, Eastern bankers and industrialists argued that adhering strictly to the gold standard was vital for maintaining the dollar's credibility on the international stage.
Proponents of the gold standard argued that introducing silver at an artificial ratio of 16-to-1 would simply trigger Gresham's law all over again.
Gold would flee the country, and the resulting financial instability would cripple the industrializing economy.
Ultimately, the gold standard prevailed politically. But the Silver Wars highlight the inherent perpetual tension in any monetary system.
The battle between debtors who desire expansion and inflation and creditors who demand contraction and strict stability.
I often visualize the gold standard as a very rigid economic straitjacket. It strictly limits the government's ability to expand the money supply.
It forces discipline, preventing a government from printing endless amounts of money.
But if a nation's economy is drowning in a severe depression, and the system desperately needs an injection of liquidity to survive, that same straitjacket prevents you from swimming to the surface.
You cannot print money to stimulate the economy because you do not have the gold to back it.
And that structural rigidity proved fatal under the pressures of the 20th century.
The massive costs of modern industrialized warfare completely shattered the discipline of the gold standard.
When World War I erupted in 1914, the major European powers immediately realized they could not fund a total war through taxation and gold reserves alone.
They universally suspended gold convertibility. They needed the flexibility to print vast sums of unbacked paper money to pay for munitions and soldiers.
We see even more aggressive state intervention during World War II. Governments imposed massive controls over their domestic economies.
In the United States, the administration established the Office of Price Administration in 1942.
They had to print massive amounts of money for military procurement, which would normally cause rampant inflation.
To suppress that inflation, the OPA enforced strict, legally mandated price freezes on everyday goods and implemented sweeping rationing programs.
The state took direct control of the monetary mechanisms.
Following the destruction of the war, delegates convened to design a new international monetary architecture. The resulting Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 established a managed post-war compromise.
The United States emerged with the strongest economy and the largest gold reserves. So the U.S. dollar was established as the global reserve currency.
It was strictly pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce.
And the currencies of the other participating nations were then pegged to the U.S. dollar.
It provided the illusion of a gold standard, filtered through the management of the American Central Bank.
This system provided stability for a couple of decades. But by the late 1960s and early 1970s, structural pressures were mounting.
The United States was running persistent, growing balance of payments deficits.
The immense financial drain of the Vietnam War, combined with domestic spending, was forcing the government to pump more and more dollars into the global economy.
Fueling inflation. And foreign governments were watching this closely. They started to seriously doubt whether the United States actually held enough physical gold to back all those paper dollars at $35 an ounce.
Countries like France and the United Kingdom began demanding the conversion of their dollar reserves into physical gold bullion.
Actively draining the American reserves.
The U.S. gold reserves were bleeding out. The system was mathematically unsustainable. This crisis culminated in the Nixon shock.
On August 15, 1971.
President Richard Nixon went on national television and announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. He unilaterally closed the gold window,
Effectively severing the world's reserve currency from a physical commodity entirely. And of course, that temporary measure became permanent.
The collapse of Bretton Woods thrust the global economy into an era of free-floating fiat currencies, values determined entirely by market forces and central bank policy.
With no physical anchor. The transition was brutal. The 1970s were characterized by severe economic turmoil, most notably stagflation.
A paralyzing combination of stagnant economic growth, high unemployment, and double-digit inflation.
Central banks had to painfully learn how to manage fiat money through trial and error. This eventually led to the highly restrictive anti-inflation policies implemented by Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve.
Where interest rates were pushed to unprecedented heights to break the inflationary psychology. But the psychological vertigo of 1971 is difficult to overstate.
It shifts everything.
When you really stop and think about it, if money is no longer tied to a tangible asset,
Not gold, not silver, not barley.
what exactly are we holding in our wallets? What does a digital balance on a screen actually represent? Are we all just participating in a massive, shared national hallucination?
We exchange pieces of paper or send digital signals, and we all simply agree they have purchasing power because the government asserts that they do.
That profound conceptual leap requires us to step into the theoretical battlegrounds of modern economics. To understand the mechanics of the money we use today, we have to examine how economists fundamentally disagree on why this fiat system functions and why it sometimes fails.
And we are presenting these theories impartially.
Reporting on the core arguments detailed in the sources without endorsing any single viewpoint. The primary division lies between two schools of thought, mentalism and chartalism.
Mentalism represents the classical view. It is the belief that money's value fundamentally derives from intrinsic properties.
Its physical scarcity, its durability. According to this view, money evolved organically from the bottom up, driven by merchants seeking to overcome the friction of trade.
Chartalism, conversely, argues something entirely different. The term was formalized by Georg Friedrich Knapp in his 1905 work.
The state theory of money.
Chartalists posit that money is, above all else, a creature of law. Its value does not come from intrinsic properties. Instead, its value derives entirely from state fiat.
The crucial operational mechanism in chartalism is taxation.
Yes, by levying taxes on the population and legally demanding that those taxes be paid exclusively in the state's chosen fiat currency, the government artificially creates an inescapable, universal demand for that currency,
regardless of whether it is backed by gold or just printed on paper. Another major critical perspective we must examine is the Austrian School of Economics.
Associated with figures like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian critique focuses heavily on the dangers of a currency completely unanchored to a commodity.
They argue that a fiat system gives central banks the unchecked power to artificially manipulate interest rates and continuously expand the money supply.
Completely insulated from the natural discipline of a free market. The core of their argument is that this manipulation distorts the crucial price signals that coordinate an economy.
So when a central bank pushes interest rates artificially low to stimulate growth, it creates a false signal.
It makes it appear to businesses that there is an abundance of saved capital ready to be deployed.
According to the Austrian business cycle theory, this false signal prompts businesses to undertake massive malinvestments,
Funding unsustainable long-term projects that the underlying economy cannot actually support. This creates an artificial boom.
But because the resources are not actually there, the boom inevitably collapses into a painful bust when reality sets in.
And to support their deep concerns about the unchecked expansion of fiat money, critics frequently point to harrowing historical case studies of hyperinflation.
Like the Weimar Republic in 1923.
Faced with crippling war reparations, the central bank simply printed marks continuously to pay obligations. The expansion of the money supply vastly outpaced the real economy.
Until inflation reached astronomical, physics-defying levels, completely destroying the currency and wiping out the savings of the middle class.
We saw similar devastating dynamics play out in Zimbabwe in 2008.
A vital mechanical concept often discussed within these critiques is the Cantillon effect.
Named after the 18th century economist Richard Cantillon. This theory describes how new money, when injected into an economy by a central bank, does not distribute itself evenly or instantaneously.
It enters through specific channels. Let's trace the plumbing.
If a central bank creates $1 billion to purchase assets, the first entities to receive that new money are usually the government itself, primary dealer banks, and large financial institutions.
These early recipients gain a massive advantage. They get to spend or invest this new money at the current existing market prices before the broader inflation hits.
As that money slowly trickles down through the system, through corporate borrowing and vendor payments, it drives up the prices of assets and goods.
By the time a new money reaches the average wage earner, inflation has already occurred, eroding their purchasing power.
The Cantillon effect argues that fiat expansion inherently transfers wealth from the late recipients to the early recipients closest to the money printer.
So we have to try to synthesize this intense debate. Is money fundamentally a tool discovered by enterprising merchants to overcome the friction of trade, relying on intrinsic value?
Or is it fundamentally a leash created by powerful governments to quantify debt, command resources, and extract taxes?
The fascinating thing about looking at the entire historical timeline is that it provides substantial evidence for both narratives.
It does. When you look at the Lydian electrum coins or the organic global adoption of the gold standard, it heavily validates the metalist focus on intrinsic properties.
But when you look at the sophisticated ancient Mesopotamian temple ledgers tracking barley debts, or the medieval English tally sticks tracking tax obligations without any metal changing hands,
It strongly supports the chartalist view of state-driven, credit-based money of account.
the most accurate reading of the historical record suggests that money is not a single, static invention.
It is a highly dynamic social technology. Throughout history, the nature of money has constantly shifted and oscillated between these two poles.
Between the intrinsic physical commodity and the abstract institutional credit ledger, it adapts its form based entirely on the specific needs, the scale, and the power structures of the society utilizing it.
And as we look at the final stages of this evolution, we see money accelerating toward total abstraction.
The late 20th century brought the widespread adoption of plastic credit cards, which essentially decoupled daily transactions from the immediate presence of funds.
Vastly accelerating the velocity of consumer debt. And then in 2009, the landscape shifted again with the introduction of cryptocurrencies and decentralized digital ledgers.
These technologies offered a completely new paradigm, attempting to create a verifiable, globally recognized unit of account that is entirely independent of central state banks.
Relying on cryptographic math instead of institutional decree. It is a remarkable, sweeping trajectory.
We have traced a path from a Babylonian priest pressing a reed into a wet clay tablet to record a deposit of barley, all the way to a modern central bank committee adjusting digital interest rates on a dashboard.
The physical form of the money has changed entirely, iterating from shells to metal to paper to pure data.
But the core function remains. It is still a mechanism to measure human trust, to quantify social obligation, and to facilitate the complex web of interactions that define civilization.
The entire monumental edifice is built purely on our collective willingness to wake up every morning and believe in it.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought to mull over as we conclude. If money has continually evolved from physical commodities to paper promises, and has now transitioned into pure, frictionless digital information residing on servers, what is the next logical frontier?
It's an important question.
If we look at the modern economy, our personal data, our human attention, and our digital reputations are rapidly becoming the most aggressively mined, quantified, and traded commodities on the planet.
Data is the new asset.
Are we slowly reverting back to a highly sophisticated version of that ancient tribal potluck, Are we heading toward a future where our verifiable identity, our behavioral data, and our digital standing within the global community literally is our currency? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.